book that we are going to read today has several different names. You may know it as the book of Revelation, you may know it as the Apocalypse of John, or the Apocalypse of John of Patmos, or even the Apocalypse of Saint John the Divine. You will see that some of these names already express a level of faith, because this text has been read over the course of history by many secular readers. Many people have been interested in its qualities as a literary text, as a cultural text, but above all, it's a very important sacred text. It forms part of the Christian Bible, and it is the last book of the Christian Bible that was added to the Bible, to what is now known as its canonical form. So when theologians decided which books would be included in the definitive version of the sacred text, this is a process known as canonization, selection of sacred texts. The book of Revelation was the most recent text that they chose to include. It's the text that, as it were, wraps up the narrative of the Old and New Testament as they come together in the canonical Christian Bible. It's a text that narrates the end of history. History is imagined as linear time and as divinely ordained, meaningful time. So the narrative of the Bible begins with Genesis, with the book of creation, and ends with the book of Revelation, the Last Judgment. There are different names for this. When we talk about teleology, we mean that history, the unfolding of time, is imagined as linear, leading to an endpoint. And when we refer to this endpoint, we can also use the word eschaton. Eschaton is the final moment. And so when we talk about the study of last things, we also call this eschatology. The book itself also has a name which comes from the Greek. It's called Apocalypse, and the word apocalypse comes from the Greek apokalyptein, to reveal. So it's a book of revelation. It's the moment when the narrator, John of Patmos, finds out about all the things that will happen in his future. So the meaning of the history of the world is revealed to him. Now, if you look at the book, it's actually quite an interesting and quite a difficult text to read. The first thing that you will notice is that the opening chapters are not actually yet a description of the apocalyptic narrative proper, but they are a series of letters that John writes to different Christian communities in Asia Minor. This tells us something about the time when this text was written. We believe that the book of Apocalypse dates back to the final decades of the first century after the birth of Christ. There's some disagreement exactly over when it was written, but we're talking about a period probably from the sort of mid-60s to the mid-80s of the first century of the Christian era. And John of Patmos was in all likelihood a historical figure, was in all likelihood the author of this text, and he's not the same John as John the Apostle, although for many centuries there was a tradition in Christian interpretations of the text which affirmed that these two were one and the same John. And this is one of the reasons we believe that why the text was included as part of the canonical Bible. The time when John wrote this book was a time of great uncertainty, great anxiety, great upheaval, and there were different reasons for this. The main reason was that the Roman Emperor, Emperor Domitian, was very hostile to the Christian communities, and there was a persecution of Christians. But also within the Christian communities, there were differences of view over how to interpret the teachings of Christ. None of these teachings were yet formulated in any definitive order. So John writes this text first of all to affirm, we believe, the importance of the Christian tradition in an age of persecution, and secondly, to insist on his own particular vision of Christianity. And one thing which many commentators have noted, which you will note if you read the text and if you're familiar with other parts of the Hebrew Bible, or particularly also the New Testament, it's an anomalous text. The values of the book of Revelation are very unlike some of the values that are stated by Christ in the Gospels. The Gospels insist on the importance of forgiveness and love. The book of Revelation is very much a narrative of confrontation, of violent struggle, of epic battles, of bloodshed. I'm not going to go into the text in great detail now, but I invite you to read it, and as you read it, please reflect on whether you will recognize some of these figures. Some of the characters of the book of Revelation are extremely influential, and they recur in our cultural history. Our cultural history, at this point, I would say is not necessarily only the cultural history of Christianity, but the broader cultural history of the West, and indeed of the way in which history and power were imagined in the West. So this sense of linear time, this sense of teleology, but also this sense of a struggle, of a sort of final epic struggle for justice, reverberate very powerfully in the history of Christianity, in the history of the West, and also in secular ideas of end time. So when we talk about teleology, when we talk about this unfolding of history according to a single line, a single meaningful line, we don't necessarily only talk about religious visions, but we could also talk about secular political ideologies. So, for example, Hegel, the philosopher, talks about spirit unfolding in a single line as a sort of secular movement. Marx, who was very influenced by Hegel, talks about the struggle for justice and the struggle towards communism in very similar terms. So we could describe these as different traditions of thought which are not committed to a Christian idea of meaningful history, but nevertheless preserve this sense of linear time. So we said that the text was written in an age of great uncertainty, that was written during the persecution of the Christians. It was one of many texts which were written at that time. Several other texts were also written in a similar form. They're all called apocalypse. Apocalypse is the name of this genre of religious writing. None of these other texts were included in the Christian Bible. They were excluded from the Bible during the processes of canonization, and in fact they're now known as apocrypha. Apocrypha are texts which are not selected to be part of the canonical Bible. So one more thing to say about this is that there are several earlier traditions in the Bible that can be described as apocalyptic. And there are several models for John. And biblical scholars and theologians distinguish between a tradition of prophecy in the Hebrew Bible or in the so-called Old Testament, and a tradition of apocalypticism. And the difference essentially is that prophecy is a narrative of divine warning. So a prophet is sent at a moment of crisis, is sent back to the people of Israel to warn them that if they do not change their ways, there will be divine punishment. So prophecy contains this nucleus of divine warning, but does not make any definitive claim about the future of history. Apocalyptic writing, if you wish, goes one step further and tells its readers not only if you don't better your ways, there will be punishment, but tells them according to the divine plan, these things will happen in the future. So it's not just a word of warning, but it's, as I said, it's an unfolding, it's a revealing of a divine meaning in history. And if you read this chapter from When Time Shall Be No More by Paul Boyer, you will find that Boyer summarizes 3 previous sections of the Bible, in the 2 in the Hebrew Bible and 1 in the New Testament, which are already apocalyptic in that sense. So these passages can be found in the book of Ezekiel, in the book of Daniel, and in the Gospel of Mark. So the text that we will focus on for our discussion is the book of Revelation, but just as we can find many of the tropes and some of the characters of the book of Revelation in our own cultural present, 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, for example, in popular culture, in a very similar way, John already borrows from these earlier traditions. So some of these characters are not the fruit of John's imagination, but already occur in these earlier religious texts.